Hello students, today's video lecture is an overview of the upper extremity bones. So we're going to learn the bones of the arm. When we're finished with the arm, we're going to continue on with the bones of the legs. So get your colored pencils ready. We've previously labeled and learned the bones of the skull, the vertebrae, and the rib cage. So I just want to point out to you that this bone over here is the sternum. That is not part of the limb. So what we're concentrating is the upper limb or the arm, and then on the next page, the lower limb. However, the limb obviously connects to the main portion of the body, which is what we've studied previously. So we're looking right here, what we call the collarbone. This is the clavicle. So the actual anatomical name of the bone is the clavicle. Oftentimes people refer to it as the collarbone. So I'm going to put the common name here in parentheses and the scientific name over here. Now, the clavicle makes a joint with the sternum. We can see that it comes all the way over here. This is where our limb connects to our actual main part of our body. So this is a functioning movable joint right here. The next bone is on the back side mostly, and that's kind of tucked back in here. This is commonly called the shoulder blade, and we can see part of it just peeking above there, and then the rest extending down here. So this bone is called the scapula. So scapula is the scientific name, and then oftentimes people refer to it as the shoulder blade. Keep in mind, it is on the back side of the body, so I just wanted to show you this on the anatomy app. It's got all the ligaments, so you'll have to kind of look past those. Here's the clavicle. See how it makes a joint with the sternum, specifically the manubrium. And then it also, we can see, makes a joint with the scapula. Okay, so that's way back there behind the ribs. Tons of ligaments holding the shoulder area together. So these ligaments right here hold the scapula to the clavicle. Moving on, this bone of the upper arm is called the humerus. And the humerus makes a joint with the scapula up here. This is our ball and socket shoulder joint. And then on the lower end, it has all these little knuckly projections that help it make a joint with these two bones of the forearm. And obviously we call this area the elbow. So we have just a single bone in the upper arm called the humerus. As we progress down into the forearm, you can see it gets a little bit more complicated. There's two bones in the forearm and then a lot of bones in the wrist and hand area. So we have two bones in the forearm, and the way we kind of remember which one is which is by assigning them a position either on the thumb side of the forearm or on the pinky side of the forearm. So D, this bone that's on the thumb side of the forearm, is called the radius. And I'm going to make a note that it's on the thumb side of the forearm, and the forearm is like the lower arm. So the radius makes a joint with the humerus, and then on the distal end of the bone, on the lower end, it makes a joint with the wrist bones. So it's actually more active in the wrist in terms of how it's used during movement than it is at the elbow side. So that's the radius. And then right next door to it, on the pinky compare the size of the word ulna to the size of the word radius, the ulna is a little word. So keep the little word with the little finger, which is the pinky. And there's actually much more to the ulna than what we can see. There's quite a bit behind the humerus. I'll show you that in the app in just a second. You can see the ulna also stretches down to the wrist, but it's not quite as involved in the wrist compared to the radius. The ulna is more involved in the elbow end. And if we take a look at the anatomy app, here's the humerus. The radius is on the thumb side of the forearm, and then the ulna is on the pinky side. But if I delete all these ligaments, what we can see is that the ulna actually extends well past where we can see on the front. See how it reaches up and behind? And in fact, that's our elbow point. The ulna forms the elbow point. So we can see that that is on the pinky side of the forearm, and the radius is on the thumb side of the forearm. So the next section is the wrist and hand, and we can see there's so many tiny little bones. I've actually enlarged it over here so we can see it a little better. So up until this point, we've been looking at the long bones of the arm. These two are long bones. The humerus is a long bone. The clavicle is a long bone. The scapula is actually a flat bone. But when we get to the wrist, we see these are short bones. And the short bones of the wrist are called the carpals. Now, there are 8 bones in this little clump in the wrist area. Okay, so this is just obviously zoomed in over here. So in parentheses, I'm going to write wrist because that's kind of the area that we denote the carpals as being in. And when we color the carpals, sort of count them as I color, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is all of 6. There's actually 2 here, 1 in the front, 7, and then the 1 behind it, which is kind of hard to see, 8. But those are the carpals of the wrist. And as we move into what we would consider the palm area of the hand, these are all metacarpals. So extending from the carpals to form the palm area are the metacarpals. And we're back to long bones now. Just these here in the hand. So there are 5 metacarpals in the hand region, and it's kind of a clever way to distinguish between them. We literally just number the metacarpals. So this is metacarpal number 1, this is metacarpal 2. We start on the thumb side with 1. This is 3, this is 4, and this is 5. So a very common fracture of the hand, if somebody punches a wall or something that is immovable, they will very often fracture the 4th or 5th metacarpal. It's extremely common. It's called a boxer's fracture. So these are all metacarpals. And then notice the rest of what we have. That's here, metacarpals. The rest of what we have here are the fingers. So we would call metacarpals hand bones, and then these are the phalanges. But I'm not going to color every one of these bones the same color because, as you can see, there are 14 different bones that are in the phalanges category. So what they have done is differentiate between this bone, and this bone. We still use the numbers, however. So I'm going to extend those same numbers to the end of the finger, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, because we still use those same numbers, but we have to differentiate because look, there's 3 different number 2s, there's 3 number 3s, there's 2 number 1s, that's the thumb. So the way that we do that is by differentiating based on their position. So we're going to use some directional terms. This finger bone that's closer or up the limb, closer to where the limb attaches to the body, is known as the proximal. And we, instead of saying phalanges, because we're talking about an individual bone, you have to use its singular form, which is phalanx. So this bone in this orange color is a proximal phalanx, this one individual bone right here, and it's actually the second proximal phalanx, or proximal phalanx 2. This is proximal phalanx 1. Proximal phalanx 3 is here, proximal phalanx 4, proximal phalanx 5, and all in orange are my proximal phalanges. Now, proximal just means up the limb. So that would be these here, proximal phalanx, because it's up the limb in relation to these two. Now, if we go all the way to the fingertip, the end of the fingertip, we see the opposite of proximal. It's here in this little greenish color. And that is distal, down the limb. So these are all distal phalanges in green. And then I will use the singular form because it technically is just pointing at this one. So that's distal phalanx 2. Here's distal phalanx 1. Okay, so that's the very end of the hand. What are we going to do about this one in the middle? It's the easiest answer. It's called a middle phalanx because it's in the middle. Between the proximal and distal phalanx sits a middle phalanx. And because it's pointing at this one specifically, which is a number 2, it's middle phalanx 2. A couple things. Let's notice, where's the middle phalanx on the thumb? There isn't one. There is no middle phalanx 1. We start out with middle phalanx 2 because see all these 2s line up. All the 3s line up. All the 4s, all the 5s. So this is the middle phalanx. And remember, when we talk about them as more than one, we say phalanges. We have 5 in orange proximal phalanges, 5 in green distal phalanges. There's only 4 middle phalanges because number 1 does not have one. There's no first middle or middle phalanx 1. Okay, that takes care of the upper extremity.